Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you. Today marks the beginning of a series of 5 book releases involving RMA in the context of their retrospective exhibition on 30 years of their work. And today we will start with the project Hathigaon, which is, as I know, a settlement for elephants, and also looking into the monograph Hathigaon, Settlement for Elephants and Mahouts. I would like to welcome today's panelists, Sanjeev Vidhyarthi, Megha Bhatnagar, Gaurav Bhatnagar and Rajan Bhatt, Mehrotra and Robert Stevens, as well as the moderator, Mustansir Dalvi. Very warm welcome to all of you. We hope to see you for the entire series of events focusing on publications involving Mehrotra and the RNA. That's on the 21st, Mumbai Reader, on the 22nd, Working in Mumbai, then on the 27th, Extreme Forensic 6, Sanitation as Infrastructure, and on the 28th, The Kinetic City and Other Essays. On the 30th, we will have a special walk through the gallery with Rahul and the artist Altrim. Due to the limitations of audience related to the current COVID restrictions, all the events are being live streamed on our social media channels. And I'm very happy to inform you that we have scheduled walkthroughs on the days of the events and have also produced podcasts and videos to ensure that people can engage with the content of the exhibition beyond the exhibition itself. The podcast series, Making of a Practice, is available on Apple and Spotify. And now, I wish all of you an interesting and insightful evening. Thank you very much.
So, good evening, everyone, and welcome for this very special event. I suppose if the book is being published, then one should release the book. And if I'm not wrong, there are some copies right over there. We should start with releasing the book, and I hope Sanjeev and Rajan will also join us virtually in the release of the book. I think that is a special thing. So why don't you open it and we can all be photographed in the process.
Yeah.
Hey, not cover the descriptors.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And now to the book itself, and I would invite Sanjeev to talk about the book, and I think he has a presentation as well. So Sanjeev, may I ask you to start your presentation? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
All right.
Right. So could you start your presentation, please?
Sure. Okay. Thank you for the book release. I didn't actually see the print, but I can imagine this took a little time and effort, and we'll speak about it. So the two things that I want to do right at the onset is to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to introduce the authoring team, sort of took a team apart putting this out together. So the first question is, why a book like this? You know, this is an interesting question, because what we usually have in contemporary Indian architecture is either we have one kind of books that take a stock of the longer trajectory of architectural development in the country. Rahul Mehrotra's Architecture During 1990s is the book that comes to mind in that way. Also Peter Schreiber, Srivastava's book on tracking some of the more recent development in architecture, the second book in that way that comes to mind. And then you have more recently books that sort of architects have written about their own practice, or documenting the development of their architecture. So those are the two kinds of sort of templates, if you will, of the kind of architectural writing that happens in India. Whereas this book is sort of a design phenomenon, which sort of takes a deep dive into one single project. So why did we choose to sort of focus on one singular project? And I think it's an interesting story that sort of picks up. Rahul was visiting Jaipur for a triple ID event, and he gave a talk, and then he was planning on visiting Hathigaon, and I tagged along with him, and we toured the place together. And what came clear while visiting the place with Rahul and his description of the place and looking at the larger setting, I had been sort of working in the Altrim area with a group of French architects. That's another book that came out of this previous effort. And sort of, it stood out that there were several cutting-edge design ideas that were at play in this place. For example, one of the things that stood out immediately was contextual fit. Architects and designers like to talk about context in many ways, that the project should support the context and fit it. But in Hathigaon, and sort of walking on that side, and that conversation with Rahul sort of continued after that, about the placement of this project in the larger trajectory of post-independence Indian architecture, the context of Rajasthan and Jaipur and Bombay in particular. Kevin Lynch has argued that many times you try to make a project that fits the context, but oftentimes you also make the context fits the project. That's an interesting part, that it can work both ways. So that's how Hathigaon's site in 2007, that's the time when the project was born, and that's how it looked. And if you are an architect paying attention to what this place is, and if elephants have to live here, but the two things that stand out and which goes, which is where RMA, I sort of took a firm stand, which established the main pillar of their design concept, was that elephants need water and foliage to be happy in this landscape, right? So that was sort of the one guiding force that sort of guided this effort. And that's how this place looked. Right? So it's about water and habitation, and sort of keeping the elephant as the primary client. And that's the sort of contextual fit. It's changing the context to fit the project at some level. And then changing or playing around with the architectural form. And there's a larger context to this place. Hathigaon is situated next to Amir, and Amir, as we know, sort of precedes Jaipur by at least 600 years. Sort of takes you to the medieval time, the difference, the location, the regional landscape, the regional geography, and so on and so forth. So there is that, this is a map Gaurav prepared, which sort of tracks some of this topography, and then the cradle of almost man-made water system. This is desert, you want to collect and store every drop of water, and that's an idea that Hathigaon takes to its core. But sitting within this larger context, where you see the walled city of Jaipur was the southeast corner, but that would happen only in the 17th century, whereas the larger landscape, the regional landscape that frames this project, has been a work in progress for the preceding 700-800 years. And Hathigaon sort of sits well within that crack. So you see the hills at the back, and once these trees have grown, you can sort of imagine, grow further, then this would sort of fit very well within that context. So this contextual fit immediately stood out. The second thing that stood out, for example, the way this project was done is the idea of pragmatic approach. You can think of pragmatic approach in several ways. The most important is, at some level, within the tradition of pragmatist philosophy, is the notion that you pay attention to what's more important and the resources at hand, and then you sort of work together as to what could work the best. One way this comes clear in this project, as we sort of began to think about this, was the political evolution of Hathigaon, right? We know projects are sort of prioritized with electoral cycles, governments change, and then projects go on backward. And sort of, as architects, we do not really pay attention oftentimes to this political dynamic. But a more pragmatic approach would argue sort of taking stock, and then, then working with your stakeholders and working with different kinds of clients. As you can see here, given that this project sort of brings together elephants and humans in a physical place, all sort of agencies were involved, development authorities, forest department, and then the project had the touristic implication. And so there is this sort of a much more dynamic sort of terrain, and then paying attention to this aspect for development of projects to now. Not many architects sort of do this kind of an engagement. And this was not only lip service play to the political side of things, but it also involved sort of working with the community, working with the elements. So, working on the side, and then sort of thinking of the larger economic development aspects of this place, what the future. So while we were inside and now describing and sort of walking around and sort of looking at these aspects, it became clear that this is a project that, sort of encapsulates a very interesting moment in time. They'll be thinking about settlement planning in the face of climate change and this larger social restructuring. And this project sort of combines several of these ideas, looking at a very specific landscape of farming and speaks multi-dimensional to this unique problem at hand. The third thing that stood out for us when we sort of dig deeper into this project was the idea of integrated planning and design. Oftentimes, folks work in silos, so the landscape architect would say, hey, I do only landscape, and the interior designer does only interiors, and civil engineer. But here was a project where you could not actually be in a silo, right? You had to combine things very cleverly. Ideas from landscape architecture, which sort of form the base layer as we talk about border, but also design, and then ideas about spatial planning. And then so this project sort of integrates various dimensions of physical planning, urban design, landscape architecture, and so on and so forth. And that came very clear. So this is sort of the template, if you will, where you can imagine the different layers. As I said, landscape architecture sort of played in a very fundamental level. The base layer was collecting and storing rainwater, and then supporting foliage of various kinds that sort of local to nature and apply with less more water would be useful. And then the other thing. So architecture at that scale is diminutive. It's less than 3% of the ground coverage. So, thinking about the future of this place, what happens to it as these ideas sort of roll, thinking about clients, and I'm sure Rahul will speak a little bit more in detail, right? Who's the client of this project? Is it the elephant? Is it the Mahouts and their family? Or is it the government which is organizing some of this? Or is it the tourist activity? And so the idea of client sort of fit, and this is difficult to do if you treat it only as an architecture project, right? So combining of these ideas. And this stood out that this project requires a little more thinking through. And then we could have done it fast. Once this conversation began to happen, it took some time and work to conceive and organize this effort. Megha, my co-author from this book, is a Jaipur-based architect. She grew up in that city. She understands that city. We sort of began talking about digging deeper into this. Rajan Bhatt, another co-author, is an avid photographer who sort of knows this this relationship, you need a certain sensitivity, talking to, elephants and the people and the place. Right? This brings together the three vital components in this project: the elephants, the Mahouts, and the physically designed settlement together. So to sort of document and prolong this place. Gaurav, the final, he was a late architect, but that's Gaurav. Gaurav also trained as an architect. He, in the last few years, his work has sort of been more into environmental aspects. The bird and fish person has that. And we had to get him in. Gaurav, he began by, he said, I'll see, but he understands that landscape framing of the project well. He spent a lot of time. He also grew up in Jaipur, so he knew at some level the geography and the environmental framing of this project better than most. So we looked at we began looking at different aspects of this project, and the table of contents here in the book sort of frames it in a certain way. We looked at the backstory, we looked at the regional landscape, we sort of framed this project in the larger trajectory. And then we were lucky when Ella Singhal, who represents Architecture Foundation, that's the custodian of the records and the documents and the plans for Hathigaon, joined us and sort of wrote a chapter along with us in this book. We requested Rahul to sort of reflect upon this experience once the book was put together. And it was very interesting in a sense that our publisher is an architect too. So everyone involved in this project is an architect, including the publisher, who originally from Barcelona, eventually sort of fell in love with India, now resides in Chandigarh and works on these projects. And I sort of, Ariana and I sort of worked on several aspects of this geography. So we had this collaboration going on. We had already done these two books. We were also working at that point in time with a book called Chandigarh, which comes out slowly, and Hathigaon. So Ariana over the time has sort of developed this expertise, if you will, or sort of a focus on writing about this geography. And then she could help all of us sort of come together. And finally, I think today we are lucky that one of the most committed designers in the project, Robert Stephens, has also joined us. Robert trained as an architect from Virginia Tech and showed up at RMA in Mumbai and has been there for the last 15 years or so. And he sort of put together a new website, sort of compares some of the archival research of places in India with their recent photographs. So, it turned out to be, which is a rare, I would think, happening where architects from different backgrounds, different understandings came together and sort of, took a deep dive into the project, putting together a design that combines and understands. So one way to think of this is a detailed case. This is a book that can be used as a detailed case, how we sort of examine how the theoretical work shapes the making of a place, and how does that making of a place, if we understand that story right, can help us think about architecture and practice. So at a simple level, this is a very fortunate moment that this book eventually gets launched in an exhibition showcasing art and architecture and practice. And I think that's sort of a very important gesture at the level that much of the work that we found RMA did with this project was combining the sophisticated knowledge that comes from experience and experiential learning, and then using it in the context of the place, which is, on the one hand loaded with a lot of history and geography, but also sort of pregnant with many potential opportunities. So, to sum, it's an architectural project sort of put together by a team of architects And I sort of, and incidentally also being moderated, the panel being moderated by Mustansir Dalvi, whom many of you know. And if you went to JJ like I did, or I did in the 80s, there's no way you didn't know Mustansir. Right? So, which is again, I think, a fantastic moment where several of us are lucky to get together too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. That was a wonderful introduction to the book. May I just check if I can be heard? Yeah, all right. Right. So I think it would be a good idea just to dive into the book in detail. And I would probably ask questions of all the panelists, but I would like to begin by asking questions to Rahul. Moving backwards, actually, I started reading your epilogue first. And in one sense, that is a roundup of everything in the book. So there are two important points which you make in that, which I hope you could elaborate upon, which really challenge the conventional notions of what an architectural design project should be. The first is you talk about the architect becoming an advocate for the different actors in this project, and you also talk about defining the client. So Sanjeev did mention this, but I hope you can elaborate on it. You know, who was the client? Was it the patron, the operational clients, the users? How do you define the client in a project that starts from 2007 and is still continuing?
Thank you. Thanks, Musti. That was that's an important but a question I'm going to really have to unpack, and I'm glad you asked it. Sanjeev, thank you for that presentation, and Rajan, good to sort of see you on screen. So I think Sanjeev kind of alluded to it in the way he talked about the three things that sort of drove the project. And honestly, really the book and our conversations and many of these observations just come from that, I think, 2 or 3 hour walk Sanjeev and I did through Hathigaon when I was visiting Jaipur, and many sort of things emerged. And so I want to kind of actually start by framing what Sanjeev said differently. And this is something that actually triggered off the project, but Sanjeev didn't allude to it so specifically, which is that both of us agreed that also what was unique about Hathigaon was that it was a project at the middle scale. And scale matters, and we both felt that perhaps our agency as professionals is very effective at the middle scale, and we don't pay it enough attention. We either get into the abstraction of planning or the specificity of architecture as an object, and often treated as an autonomous object, right? And therefore what is then celebrated is its cultural quality. In fact, its autonomy is being celebrated, which is a real problem. And I think whether it's in the challenges of pedagogy that you and I and many of us deal with, but it's also in what we finally see emerging in our cities and the kind of disjunctures that occur within urban fabrics or even rural landscapes as a result of it. So the middle scale, I believe we haven't paid enough attention to, and this was what I think really excited Sanjeev and me. It was that kind of eureka moment where we said, like, that might be what needs to be celebrated because our agency is the greatest. Now, that sort of is also linked to the question of clientele and patronage, because at the middle scale, the expansiveness of the constituent groups that you have to address expands. And therefore, then the role of the architect becomes that one of a bridge practice, right? You begin to actually bridge the aspirations of the different constituencies sort of involved. And the way I kind of describe it is that every project has, if you unpack what the client is, there let me say emblematically 3 components. One is the patron client, one is the operational client, and one is the user client. And the patron client is the one who might have, the financial patronage, but also the patronage in setting up the aspirations of the project, if the patron is enlightened, and all of that. The operational client is the client that makes it happen. In this case, I think that slide Sanjeev showed, the bureaucracy. And it was a changing bureaucracy, so our operational client changed every year, depending on who was in power, who the chief secretary was, and changed. So the party changes, so the patronage changes. Patronage also changes, but also the operational client changes. And the user clients in this case were the Mahouts and the Elephants, right? Now, in a weekend house or a single family house, all those three entities collapse into one, and it makes it frictionless. But the frictions are great. So really, the architect becomes, when I say a bridge, you serve two functions. One is you serve the function of creating feedback loops between the different constituencies. So for example, the Mahouts have no access to the chief minister, but we had access to the chief minister. The public works department has access to the chief minister, but in a kind of, in a relationship of deferment, in a sense, it's very difficult for them to even put a demand forward, correct? And they treat the Elephants and the Mahouts in a kind of, in a pecking order that's really uncomfortable and brutal sometimes, right? So then the architect's role, and we discovered all this in hindsight. This is on reflection, and that's why the book was so important, even for us to learn from all of them about these reflections. Because while we were doing this, we were frustrated. I mean, we would go to site with resignation letters saying, "This is the last visit. We don't have anything to do with these guys," and we would go there. And we would empathize with what we saw, we would be moved by situations, and we would keep going. And so the architect's role then is to, one, make vivid and comprehensible everybody's aspirations and get them on the same table, and create the critical feedback loops that can inform decisions such that those aspirations come together. And I think that has been the greatest learning, and truly, I don't think I could have articulated what I've just articulated if one hadn't reflected through the process of doing this book on what the project meant, especially because of the long duration of the project.
Can I add one line to the place? Because I remember, so we're based in Mumbai, and we're working all throughout the country. We travel, do day trips, go to sites. They're noisy, they're dusty. So I remember, and I think it was 2014, we went for a site visit. It had just rained, and that image you saw with the water, the trees, the ponds in the background, it had just rained, it was silent, and I heard birds. And I've never heard birds at site before. It was fabulous. Like, these are birds, it's Mumbai, we have maybe 2 or 3 species. There were dozens of species, and it was like poetry. So I remember going back and saying, the birds are fabulous. We have to evolve the landscape, with Mohan Rao to kind of serve them. So they became a new clientele. And that was a very special, I think, moment, because it was a whole different set of, of layers to the project.
I think as an architect, I would definitely say, and this is something that nobody has mentioned in the book at all, is maybe you need to do some workshops on this, is how to have an amazing amount of patience, just to see this through. I think it's over and beyond the call of duty, and maybe that's the only way that this project is complete because of that.
I can speak to that in the same way, anecdotally, as Robert has raised this question, and I mean this in all sincerity, and I hope I can say this in a way that doesn't offend or get me into any trouble. But we paid a lot of attention, as Sanjeev talked about, to the landscape and things. And really, the way I describe this project is we designed the landscape with Mohan Rao first, and we put the buildings in the interstitial spaces. Usually, it's the other way around, right? The parks become symbolic interstitial spaces. So it's a reversal of the process, which is complex. And, and it doesn't mean we didn't pay attention to the architecture. We actually paid a lot of attention to the architecture. We designed gargoyles in sandstone and this, that, and the other. And I remember going to site, and it was it was deepish into the project. We were already running out of our patience. We were at a point where we were saying, if this government falls again, we're just going to resign from the project. And I remember going to site, and with the Public Works Department in Rajasthan, and there's chauvinism there, which is unmatched. I remember going and looking at the building and seeing, instead of the beautiful gargoyles we had designed, they had put PVC pipes for downtakes. And I thought, this is terrible, this is exactly what you expect the Public Works Department to do. And I kind of, really began to get agitated, and I remember the senior Public Works Department engineer was there, who was one of these macho, chauvinist sort of characters. And I said, this is offensive what you've done so much, we made mock-ups, and he looked at me, and I'm going to say it in English, not in Hindi, and he just said to me, why are you wasting your time for low caste and class people? Even in my house, I have a PVC pipe. And therefore, a kind of class conflict emerged there, I think in a terrible way for me. And I don't know, maybe coming up from Mumbai or what the reasons were, but at least me personally, there was a surge of empathy that I hadn't even ever sensed before that emerged. And really, that's what gave us collectively the book. It was many little things like this which added up, which gave us more than patience. It kind of committed us in a way that it became a thing that we just got to do this, even if we have to make it happen. And honestly, we basically cross-subsidized it because there's no fees after a point and things, but we were just so moved by what we saw in a condition like that it drove us. So the patience was actually more a reaction rather than patience in the way one would think of a cultivated attribute.
I'd like to ask Robert this, because you've been part of the project. The project to design Hathigaon was won in a limited competition. So could you just tell us about your approaches to the design during the competition, and how different were they from what ultimately ended up?
So it's it's interesting because the project you see in the book, for us, it was actually about 10 projects. The initial was housing for the Mahouts and their elephants, and that was one unit. It was a module, then located on site. And then as the project evolved over the last 16, 17 years now, little things would come. And they said, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? So there was no, this is the design, and then, let's see it through. It was constantly changing depending, again, who is at power, what were the needs at site, what were at times the whims of the local bureaucracy. So it was a constant evolution, which was actually quite enjoyable. It had its own challenges, but it was also very enjoyable because it was real and it was based on the needs at that specific point.
One thing that you must have ensured throughout was to ensure the kind of very deep relationship between the Mahouts and the elephants, and that your design evolved from that thinking.
So I'll also just say a thing on the competition. It was an invited competition, and I believe that, again, just in reflection, one can say this. I believe because we made it a landscape project that it was attractive, because the narrative of water being crucial for the survival of the tropical beings, which are elephants. I mean, their being in a desert is an accident of history, is, I think, what won it. Without taking names, I know what the other project submissions were, and I think most of the architects, all the architects in the competition had actually privileged architecture. So they had taken the stables of elephants that the Maharajas had and tried to make a kind of architectonic arches and all of that from it, privileging the notion of how does one use those historical types. And I think that was the difference in our approach. It became very clear to us from the beginning that water was a protagonist not only in terms of the health of the elephants, but also in the bonding between the elephants and the Mahouts. It's the process of bathing the elephants is where their bonding really occurs, and it is just the most comforting kind of situation for the elephant, right? And I think that becomes that was a very important decision. Therefore, water was privileged for all those reasons.
I think let's take up the issue of water since you have mentioned it, and this is something I would like to ask Gaurav. You have given a very detailed account of the ecosystems of the arid areas around Jaipur in this book, and their dependence on water and some very specific forms of vegetation that happen. In Hathigaon, as we saw in the presentation, what the architects received was a completely bare and bleak site, which was, I think, a former quarry. A sand quarry, devoid of any vegetation. So, I would just like to have you talk a little bit about what were the strategies used to change this situation, because you talk about 2-3 things. You talk about the significance of a boundary wall, okay, and you talk about the site landscape and long-term ecological sustainability, things like that. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that, and obviously water being such a central thing to this project.
Yes, and basically I think water was the mainstay of the project, for any project I think, and most of northwestern India is facing a huge crisis of underground water. And Rajasthan in itself has had a long tradition of conserving water. Within Jaipur and much of the western part of Rajasthan, where there is absolutely brackish water, they only rely on rainwater. Whether it is small taka in the house or a community freshwater man-made lake. So that was the main reason why probably the project had a great context in terms of water. So I think historically speaking, I got the historical context of water also in play. Because I started my journey into nature as being a birder, an amateur birder, and then getting into photography, and that actually gave me a lot of context and connect with nature. And usually smaller projects don't have the bandwidth. Bigger projects like Hathigaon, they have the bandwidth to influence ecology. And I think it's very important to understand landscape and ecology, and sometimes they can be very different. Landscape could be very ornamental, even though using local species, it might not be part of what nature wants to be at that point. So a lot of in the regional context chapter, basically I wanted to stress upon the point the local ecology of Rajasthan, and especially Jaipur, and how local grasses, grasslands, shrubs, which are native to the region, are often neglected, and certain parts of Hathigaon, which have not been landscaped, are actually amazing in ecology. That's because they were not planted. In fact, I did a very nice GIF image, like a small animation of Hathigaon after the boundary wall came up, and how over the years it has come up. So just by Google Images, and it's quite phenomenal that in a span of 8 to 10 years, it's become a small scrub forest.
So what is the significance of the boundary wall?
Basically, what the boundary wall does is that it conserves the area from grazing and people lopping trees. Especially the thorny scrub forest, which is native to this area. There is no protection on trees, and people, especially cut the trees. So that is why it's important, and it's quite evident from if you look at the Google images.
I think you've used a very interesting phrase. You say that the water is space defining in this particular project, and that the strategies that are used are the making of embankments and what is known as swales, which is a kind of water body, but which also has greenery embedded into that. And I think what is being seen after so many years is the value of doing that. Probably, the landscape architects also probably must have had a vision to take care of the landscape, that whole area, quite early, that you can now, after 10 years, see the whole point of it.
Absolutely, and I think every year the ecology matures by itself, and I think it reaches a kind of a climax after a while, where it is in sync with the ecology of the place. And there's a small example I've put in the book. There's this bird called the grey shrike, and it's called the butcher bird. And it's called the butcher bird because what it does, it catches insects or even rats, and then it goes to an acacia tree, and because the acacia thorn is really tough and long, it pierces the prey into the thorn and creates kind of like a lard. So there's such an immediate connection to all these denizens of such ecological areas. There's a very direct connection, and you remove one tree, you feel one species is gone.
I think that's why what Robert mentioned is that you suddenly started hearing birds after a certain point, and that's a real turning point in the.
It is while we are on birds. It's actually very interesting, because the houses were not allocated for a long time. People who were living there, they were going through the process of allocation. And so the houses that were given to the occupants were very raw. And we had always fantasized that, with all the beautiful crafts and arts and Rajasthan, people will paint. And I had personally always thought, my God, this was a wonderful book that Francis and Aman had done on the painted Havelis of Shekhawati with these grand elephants painted on the facade. I thought, these houses are going to be all painted with elephants. And I remember going back for a site visit when some houses had been allocated, and we saw all the houses had been painted with birds. And the species of birds, because of the trees and the water, now there was a whole ecology developing which attracted birds. So the artists in them were painting birds. So now when you go there, you don't have anyone who's painted elephants on their houses, all painted birds. It's just amazing.
You probably paint what you can't see, but you can hear. The elephants are all around. Megha, you have recorded first-hand accounts and personal narratives of several people, the architect of course, but also the landscape consultant, the bureaucrats and mahouts. So I just wanted your impressions of the attitude of the bureaucrats whom you interviewed, and what was their understanding of this project, which was such a multi-dimensional project.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm very happy to be here, and finally the book is being launched. So what I say about the project and the book is that the project has had the gestation period of a hathi, like because it is Hathigaon, and so has the book. It has taken that long. But coming to your question, I interviewed Mr. N.C. Goel, who was first heading JDA, the Jaipur Development Authority, and in his tenure, a lot of work at Hathigaon was pushed through because he was very focused on, carrying on with the execution. But he also mentioned that it was very difficult because, again, it was a very multi-faceted project, that you had to have the forest department included, the tourism also had something to say, and the didn't have consensus. So, but then later he was also he was heading the tourism, forest, and the art and culture department. So at that time he had more control over all these things because they were to overlap, and that was the time that it worked better. But I think it was hard for the bureaucrats themselves to get consensus. And
it's also surprising why they would at all devote their energy into a project like this.
Yes, somebody has to be really very focused, like NC was.
But they have to believe in what is happening on site, which is amazing because they can't see that.
Exactly. So, the interesting part about the interviews was what I felt was that for the first time, I was standing backstage in a project and looking at different perspectives. Rahul sir's perspective, of course, being the architect and being so patient with it for so long. And the bureaucrat's perspective, and also the end user's perspective.
Right. I just wanted to ask you about that. And just before you talk about the end user, there is a phrase, there is a word which is used constantly, and that word is than. I wonder if you could explain what than is.
Yes, so than is typically a residence for the elephant. The space where the elephant resides, that is called than in the local language. So,
it has a special configuration.
Yes, it has a special design and configuration because the elephant, by its structuring and its muscle structure, it can't lay flat on the ground. So it has to have a little berm or a slope onto which it can lie down. So that is the geometry that has been followed. And
in the making of the elephant stalls.
In the making of the than where the elephant resides, and of course the dimension of the dimension and the anthropometrics of the elephant, of course. And then there's a very interesting thing that Rahul sir also mentioned, that there's a connectivity with the family of the mahout, because mahout and the elephant have a very close and complex relationship. So they are connected visually, but the elephant can't step onto the main open area where the kids are playing. And
I think that is done with an opening
yes.
in the wall between the elephant's area and the mountain's area.
Yes. Right. So the elephant is still visually a part of their life,
but
the elephant can't walk into that space. So it's interesting that they feel connected, but not quite there, because it could be dangerous also sometimes to the little kids.
The other thing about your interview with the end user, the Mahouts, is how do they see their own future?
Yeah, so as Balu Bhai is the person who I interviewed, he's now heading it's called the Hathigaon, it's called the Elephants Welfare Association, where they all get together and kind of look after the whole space. So he also mentioned that this is probably the last generation of mahouts, because most elephants are about 50 years of age or more, and they live usually till 80 or 85 years. So this should be the last generation.
But there is no fresh supply of elephants, so to speak.
So you can't buy or sell elephants anymore. So they are.
Stupid question. Don't the elephants produce elephants? No, seriously.
I'm sure they do, but they die also. So yeah, there's a.
Just to interject that, that's an important discussion. So I think what Megha is sort of saying is, I think now the general consensus, even legally, is that, and there's already was a push that there was a whole lobby of NGOs that wanted even the elephants right now in Hathigaon to be released in the wilderness, and which cannot be done for various reasons of, they're domesticated, political, economic reasons, because now there are other livelihoods dependent on them, etc. So in the future, I don't think you would have elephant captivity and domestication to take tourists up, and that is on its way out. So this is a process of transition. So one of the things that we had actually also designed, which never got built, was a museum on the history of the elephant and its presence, which hasn't been realized. The drawings are there, the model is there. And the idea of that was to facilitate this transition of of the role of the elephant in society to their final lives in the wilderness. And therefore then one of the things we also imagine is how complex like this then actually becomes a natural resource in a park, and transitions into another use.
One interesting thing in the book also is this interesting historical look at the elephant in at least northern India, as seen through the miniatures and paintings and even a bit of the mythology. I think that's important, perhaps, in, as you say, if a museum should emerge in the future.
In fact, before the present president of the Welfare Association, the earlier president who has now since passed, I remember in our early meetings he had a ward of miniature paintings, which were, well, they're not miniature paintings in the classic way, but they were hand-drawing paintings about A4 sort of size about how to treat the elephants Ayurvedically. So for an upset stomach, for a tooth or a tusk ache, etc. And that is when we came up with the idea of the museum, because we said, my God, this is displayed, because these are things that will be forgotten with the next generation. And of course, that didn't happen, and I have no idea where the records are.
Rajan, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, hi. You photographed Hathigaon during its changing seasons. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your observations and experiences of the coexistence between the mahouts and the elephants.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, very interestingly, like Megha also mentioned just now, that the elephants and the mahouts have a very, it's like one family, where the elephant is a part of their day to day. I mean, the entire family, they are taking it out for a ride, kind of feeding it and everything. I think the whole activity out there was actually, centered towards the elephant itself. Yes, other things that I also saw was that what I really liked is that it's not like one person is staying there. The entire family of all age group of that family, it's their entire habitat. Like the kids are there. Now the kids are not really, they are helping out their elders and other people to do it, but then they have their own life. So then there is, you can see them play, you can see them bathe, you can see them, in fact swim with the elephants or without the elephants in the same premise. And in fact, the school in the premise itself was, has been, remodeled and made nice to, sort of have, let them have their own access to education and stuff like that, which is also a part of the project and has been integrated very nicely in the entire scheme of things. So my job was to actually, take capture moments of what's going on a day-to-day basis within the project, and we could see the school kids going to school, the tourists coming in, the mahouts bathing the elephants, in fact having a quiet moment with their family, themselves having a meal and feeding the elephants. So I think this whole experience of, and then also there are community. It's not like there's one elephant or two elephants. Like 60 odd elephants were occupied when I was last visiting the place, 60 to 70. And the way this, in the mornings, there are routines that were being followed of the Mahouts bathing the elephants and getting them ready for to go to Amer or to the thing, and the kids at the same time going to the school, and at some point in the afternoon the tourist is coming in, and so I don't know, it was like being in a community space of a different kind, and a lot has been already spoken about the way that the site has been made, comfortable or appropriate to house such a community. I think that kind of excited me each time I went to the space, because after the monsoon it became greener, and the water actually was captured and easily gotten into the space where it was supposed to come, in the main place where the elephants would take a bath and everything. So for me, I think it's a very sensitively handled project, which I think is just now organically taking its own form in that sense, because like Rahul mentioned that there were like now artworks outside the tenements on the walls, and so now it's also getting personalized at the same time.
Right.
So
Yeah.
but the design still stands out in the sense that after all this time, the design stands out and it's evolving very beautifully. That kind of gave me a lot of satisfaction and gave me a chance to capture the entire essence as much as I could, which you can see in the book.
I think that is really amazing, because your photographs are very sensitive, and you can really see that the relationship between between man and animal literally here, almost as equals.
I just want to add, thank you, Mr. And thanks, of course, your images made us reflect on many things that, of course, we didn't even get the chance to experience. In fact, what you've experienced, Rajan, in the complex and seeing life in its operations was something that we never saw in our site visits in that way. But one of the things I just thought of as you were explaining your observations was something that I remember Sanjeev and I touched upon right in that first meeting when we went and we were excited about doing something, or he was excited about doing something on the project, which was this notion that, and so therefore, sorry, just one other response is many things Rajan is describing, I'll honestly say, one unintended consequences of the design. It's not that we said this is what's going to happen and that will happen and this is how this ecology will evolve, etc. And in hindsight, I think, at least as an architect, one thinks of this as an armature in which life can thrive, right? If you think of it in that's why again the middle scale becomes very important, because the notion, you can do a mega structure as an armature within which things can happen, but at the middle scale for us as architects to design a habitat as an armature, allowing life to thrive there, is a way of approaching it. So then you allow, there's an open-endedness in terms of the decisions that can occur, what will happen. And therefore the decision of making water the central protagonist allowed many things to organically evolve. So the school that Rajan is describing was one of the unintended consequences. We started there was an existing building that was broken and been abandoned from a previous project. We saw life evolving there. We came up with the idea that with very little you could renovate it, then there could be a school. That school led to teenagers. The teenagers started a company called Elephantastic. They started making money from that. It became an economy. So therefore one has to imagine projects at this scale as an armature to support life. And I think your descriptions of everything, Rajan, made me just think of that reflection.
And talking about that middle scale, I think Sanjeev, in your essay you have written this, Hathigaon exemplifies a less studied kind of progressive planning that works at the intermediate urban scale, that is in between lot level architectural projects and infrastructure oriented regional development, shaping many parts of our rapidly urbanizing planet, including contemporary India. So maybe you could reflect a little bit upon this, which of course Rahul has mentioned as the middle scale, and what kind of conceptual strategies are in fact required to make a middle scale like this succeed.
So that's a good question, mostly. I think Rahul alluded to it, and so this the intermediate urban scale. And as India urbanizes, and as we sort of begin to pay attention to cities, you sort of begin to see this phenomena across urban India. So Hathigaon is one example, which is sort of a greenfield project, a new project that sort of is not architecture alone, but it's not planning at an abstracted level of a master plan or a sub-area plan or a regional plan. It sort of sits in between that space and the continuum. Other examples would include the redevelopment of Connaught Place, the recently completed, more dense urban settings, sort of a morning urban surgery almost, as in a very Galician manner, would be the redevelopment around Golden Temple in Amritsar, the redevelopment around Kashi Vishwanath Temple in Varanasi. So India has several of these projects going on. But what was the coolest, and I sort of teach this currently at UIC, is this idea of intermediate urban scale that sort of involves, as I said, many disciplines. Right? You cannot, if you set out to do a project like this from an architectural lens, it would be a disaster, as most of the projects are. Right? You just can't be an architect and treat building as an object. You need to be paying attention to the landscape, as Gaurav rightly. That's the layer you start with. And then you have to think of planning, and then you have to think of practical. So, and increasingly, that's the pitch at some level this book makes, is that we need to be, as India urbanizes, and as the quality of architecture in India at some level is fantastic. Architecture is thrilled the projects within their side boundaries. Hospitals, hotels, gated communities, residential towers, Indian architects today design as well as architects in every part of the world. I think also at the regional level, we now sort of begin to have access to funding where we have, for example, transportation planning for areas around Mumbai or Delhi, or infrastructure planning. So we're doing regional scale stuff very well, with a lot of money coming in. The ecological insulation, notwithstanding, that's a separate story. And then we're doing these fantastic buildings. But what's happening in between is missing. And so this project stood out as an example. There's several ideas for different disciplines, different ways of thinking, different professions, if you will, like landscape architecture and architecture plan, sort of come together. So, the beauty of the intermediate scale was that it's both something that you can comprehend easily without abstracting it too much, and then you could also locate it in several different trajectories, including the development of the approach to designing and planning in the post-independence period. That's sort of the opening essay of the book, right? So I guess that would be a little long-winded answer.
No, I think it's a very significant answer to this. And Rahul, I would like you to talk about it also. It's simply that, looking at several of your projects, which I now know, the one thing that always strikes me is that there is a certain elasticity to each one of them. I don't think you overcome it in the beginning, but you just let things happen and see what possibilities are there, and then at a certain point it all kind of comes together in a very interesting and sometimes surprising way that one would not have really expected when the project began, or when it had just a very simple name in the beginning, like housing for moms, something like that.
No, absolutely, and I think that open-endedness comes from often, and even more recently, we've just done a project for the School of Arts and Sciences, which you see in the exhibition here at the Mueller Bhavan, where it was a very complex program of the arts and sciences wanting to come there, and the faculty not actually even coming up with what would be the requirements that they were changing as we were designing. And therefore then one has to shift the imagination to this notion of the armature. And so that notion of the armature, one could apply the intermediate scale, but one could also apply it, Sanjeev, at the scale of an architecture project, because then it becomes an attitude in a sense. But I just want to go back to the intermediate scale. Maybe even Sanjeev might want to respond, because I think the way you framed it, Musti, was a very, very beautifully framed. What I would say in reflection, because he's spoken about the intermediate or middle scale, is, for me, in reflection, I think the lessons of Hathigaon, the way one approached it as an armature, the intersections between landscape, architecture and planning, its relevance and the relevance of intermediate scale planning will be a key in urbanization in India when we look at our small towns. Because implicit in this kind of approach of intermediate scale is also self-sufficiency. And the compound wall becomes a metaphor or emblematic of that condition of the bounded. Yes, it's very counterintuitive, which allows bits, because in small towns, they don't have the support of infrastructure. In that sense, that self-sufficiency through ecological thinking will become critical for us to make the transition for these transitioning settlements to become viable urban centers.
Wouldn't you say that almost every brownfield project is asking for an intermediate?
Oh, absolutely.
Because there are things already.
That's correct. But I think furthermore, on the spectrum of our urbanization trajectory, where we classify megacities and intermediary towns, or class 1, class 2, the small towns, which are transitioning settlements, which are rural in their physical characteristics, but urban in their aspirational makeup, their economy, and their connections to other urban centers, that strategies like this will become very relevant. And I think that, for me, in the long view, is perhaps the most important lesson that one can extract. Sanjeev, I don't know, do you want to reflect on that? Because your work on planning more generally is important.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is an important, a critical moment when we sort of look at the large transition that's happening in India at this point in time, where we have over 7,500 identified towns that include census towns and tier 2 and tier 3 towns. And as these places become more urban, you can imagine, right? Out of 7,500, first the quality of planning that actually happens in India, and then how many, it's like only half of these have some sort of a plan, a master plan, if you will, and almost half of them have no plan so far. The 75 years of the Republic. So, as these places transition, what kind of ideas do we have? And that's where the notion of settlement planning comes where. We can think of subdividing the land, we can think of massive. But if we sort of keep a social angle in mind, right? Who's the user? Who actually lives here? Who's the resident? What kind of relationship the residents have in the place? And then sort of the larger ecological framework. What kind of landscape this place is in? And in India is unique in the sense that we have all Gaurav was talking about, and sort of paying attention to that geography and that habitat, and then if we can have this ecological and social relationship at that scale. So, this project sort of stood out. How often do you sort of see something like this, where there are sophisticated theoretical ideas, and sort of framing within a larger moment in time, to talk about 21st century urbanization, and as the way things stand, urban India seems to be pretty much the frontier, right? Our 21st century global urbanization perhaps will come to meet its very edge in urban India pretty soon. And climate change, social divisions of all kinds, and so on and so forth. So this offered in many ways, and our focus as an authoring team was sort of studying Hathigaon along various dimensions. From regional landscape framing to everyday life was to sort of document and illustrate and comprehend some of these lessons for people as they begin paying attention to urbanization and smaller cities. Then thinking of public health and thinking of relationship between, what kind of relationship could exist between settlements of different kinds on the larger questions of who gets access to what kind of goods and where. So, yes, that's sort of the larger abstract framing of this project within the organization. Gradually level going on.
And yes, and thank you, because I think in one sense that also has emerged because of the framing of this book. I suppose this book has been the agency for bringing out all these different discourses, and I think they need to be kind of taken forward. I think just before we end, maybe I can end by reading one paragraph from Rahul's piece in the book, which to me is very important in encapsulating a lot of these ideas. Not only, for the least reason is because I'm an architect and a teacher of architecture myself. I think this is very, very important. So this is what Rahul says. In spite of all this attention to the architectural aspects from this project, we learned that architecture is not and should not always be the starting point when responding to a problem. Our impulse is to believe that because a client has approached you as an architect, architecture must be the response. In retrospect, we realize that if we had not privileged the landscape, the project would never have been happening. Another important lesson from this experience is the idea of time and architecture, and how we rarely factor the temporal into our imagination. Throughout this project, things started and stopped. Governments lost elections and new administrators appeared, and the notion of time and what happens at what pace became vivid. Along with time, you also begin to accept the idea that life invariably corrodes, I like this phrase, architecture in a positive way. I think there's a whole theory that needs to be developed on the idea of corrosion. Yes. At the deepest level, this project illuminated for us that architecture and design more broadly could together be a critical instrument in the new India to help correct inequities in our society. This was not an issue we set out to address, but it became clear in retrospect that a terrible asymmetry had been corrected just by providing access to water for the poorest in that society. This would usually be the concern of a planner and not an architect. The Mahouts now have plentiful access to water year-round, while the middle class and the upper middle class in Jaipur depend on water tankers for their daily consumption. And you are residents of Jaipur, you will attest to this. For us, this was one of the profound yet unintended results of this project. It also brought to light the potent possibilities. Each view gave us another reading and definition of the issues at hand. The continual resynthesizing of the core questions from different perspectives is what opened up new priorities in the decision-making process. I think this is a very wonderful text that really tells us so much about how this project can be perceived. So I must thank you all, Sanjeev, Rajan, Gaurav, Megha, Robert, and of course Rahul, for being part of this. RMA, of course, for being the designers. And we have a wonderful book that will always remain with us to refer to when we look at projects of this intermediate or middle scale. So thank you, and thank you everyone in the audience for listening to us patiently. Since this has been going out live, I wonder if there are any questions which have come in. No, fine. So I think we have used our time well. Yes, thank you everyone, and I can simply urge everyone to get hold of copies of the book. I hope they are available. Right. So thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.